you could use the other half of the money from the stimulus funding to replace programs or people that you lost in this economy. By doing that, however, it just meant that you would get 2 years' worth of funding that when it disappeared, either the programs would have to disappear or the people would have to disappear. So at this point, looking at how much we used to get in circuit breaker and special ed and pre-K and Title I, we're seeing that out of all the money that we got in ARA funding, about $167,000 we were actually needing to use to continue the programs and the staffing that we have. So as of this year, ARA funding is gone. So that is one piece of our budget that we need to deal with next year, which is a deficit. So we're starting the year with a structural deficit. The other part that I keep getting questions asked about is how do salaries affect your budget? We're about 80% salary driven. It's an intensive, people-driven institution. So I took a look at the last 2 years. ASME is the organization or the unit that has assistants, TAs, the secretaries, custodians, and a few other scattered people in there. They received 0.5% salary increase on the top step 2 years ago, last year's budget, and so did the teachers. So when you add it all up, that was about almost a little under $200,000, about 2.7% increase to the payroll, or about a 1.2% increase to the total budget. So even though it's a small increase, it does have an impact on the budget. This year, there have been no increase to these contracts other than the step increases. And even though we talk about there is no increase, there are some things built into the contracts that, regardless of whether you have finished negotiations or not, roll over into the following year if the contract's not settled. So this year we're estimating about $150,000 to be paid in terms of step increases. They kind of are automatic. So for those people who are less than 10 years in the teacher's contract or less than 3 years in the AFSCME contract, they get that increase, and it totaled about 2% out of the payroll and about a 1% increase out of our budget. So for this year, that really was the only increase, but it does come up as an increase. Administrators haven't had increases over the last 2 years, other than this year. There were some increases to, and I made the change to active staff, and basically because we reduced the number of staff, we had money, and some of that was distributed. About $19,000 was distributed to some of the administrators in the contract. Some of them because they're increasing the amount of work that they're doing, and some of it we added more responsibilities to them. So the actual payroll for administrators has decreased for 2 years in a row. I think the first year the real decrease was, I was new, so I was making a little less than the previous superintendent, who'd been here for quite a while. However, looking at next year, we start to think, okay, we're losing some amount of money in terms of the ARA funds, so we have to account for that. I'm estimating somewhere in the neighborhood of $225,000. And in addition, we have settled the ASME contract. They have a 1% increase and steps. And I put in variable because their contract is dependent on whatever contract we present or whatever budget we finalize and present to the town. If it gets voted at town meeting this spring, then they would get the 1% that I'm going to build into their part of the contract. If it doesn't get voted, then it gives us the ability to go back and negotiate that percentage increase. So it is depending on the town passing the budget as we present it. We will. I would like to propose that we set aside a 1% for administrative salary increases as well, since the administrators haven't seen an increase in a couple of years. And then we're still in negotiation with the teachers, but just as a point of reference, I would say that if we account for the steps, which we would have to pay anyway, because there's a few less of them, and some of them have moved up beyond the 10-year mark. The increase in terms of step is a little smaller next year, or we're expecting, than this year. So it'd be about a 1% increase to the teacher's payroll. And if we were to do an across-the-board 1% increase to the salary, would mean an additional $79,000. So these are some of the variables that, while these are increasing, we have the ARA funding disappearing, so we have to cover that deficit, put the two together, and we're talking already looking at some substantial funds. A 1% increase across the salary scales for everybody. I'm talking from myself on down to the paras and TAs and custodians, including the steps that we would be responsible for, would look at about $250,000, about a 1.7% increase to the total budget. Finally, here's the piece about the Chapter 70. Originally, we were talking about trying to close a $2 billion deficit. I know the state has been tracking a better than expected revenue collection and so far this year, so that deficit may be much smaller by the time this year is over. And some of the things that they've indicated is that perhaps anywhere between a 5 and a 7% decrease in resources would be going to the communities this year. Now, whether we'll include Chapter 70, I don't know. At this point, all the indications are the governor would like to keep it intact, perhaps bump it up a little bit for next year. But if they were to go after a reduction just for, the sake of argument, 5% would be about $200,000. So if you have the reduction in stimulus about 227, salary increases about 250, and then if you add in a 5% decrease in Chapter 70, you're talking $700,000. That either would be cuts or it would be monies that we would have to add to the budget. Hopefully, that if the 5% does not materialize and we keep Chapter 70 intact, we would be in much better shape. There are some pieces of good news. One of them